For over 40 years, countless victims have waited for justice.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're examining 10 serial killer mysteries that were finally solved.
And there was also DNA evidence found here, and that evidence may solve her murder 5 decades later.
For this list, we're looking at sinister killers who were able to elude capture for years, but were eventually brought to justice. Do you know of any other murderers who took a huge amount of time and effort to hunt down? Let us know in the comments. Bradley Robert Edwards, the Claremont Killer. Between 1996 and 1997, 3 women went missing from Claremont, a suburb in Western Australia. 2 were later found dead.
The night Sarah Spears vanished from Claremont in January 1996 was the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in WA's history.
These circumstances made police suspect a serial killer was responsible, but finding that killer would require one of the longest, most expensive investigations in Australian history. Over the following years, numerous suspects were interrogated, watched, and eventually ruled out.
Lance Williams was a prime suspect in the eyes of the police. They were desperate for somebody to look at for these crimes, and he definitely put his head up over the parapet.
Then, a study of fibers from the crime scenes revealed 2 important facts: what the murderer had been wearing and what kind of car he drove. Both implicated Bradley Robert Edwards. His DNA also turned out to match samples found under one victim's fingernails.
The police had caught up with him because really science had caught up with him. It was the DNA that got police to Bradley Robert Edwards' door. It was the DNA that got him into court in 2019 for the trial.
Edwards was arrested and charged with murder in 2016 and is currently serving a life sentence in prison. François Vérove, the Pockmarked Man. Being a police officer probably helped François Vérove conceal the murders and assaults he committed in France between 1986 and 1994. However, his career ultimately proved his undoing. When a girl's body was discovered in her apartment complex in 1986, and witnesses described a stranger with acne scars on his face, the killer was dubbed Le Grêlé, or the Pockmarked Man. Vérove went on to murder at least 2 more people, but some of his victims survived, and their descriptions of his badge and radio made investigators suspect that the killer was a police officer. In 2021, they required all officers from that period to submit a DNA sample. When Vérove learned this, he took his own life, leaving behind a written confession. Bruce Lindahl, the Monster. He lived only 28 years. He was arrested and fined multiple times, but never imprisoned. It took decades for police to realize that Bruce Lindahl had been a vicious serial killer.
We finally put a name and a face to this monster, and that's pretty much what he was.
His crimes are still under investigation, but Lindahl is confirmed to have murdered 4 people and remains a suspect in 12 other murder cases in the Chicago area during the 1970s and 80s.
The crimes and body locations are all surrounding known Lindahl addresses.
So it establishes that when he was living in the Lisle-Woodridge area, he was active he hunted in the Lisle-Woodridge area. When he moved to Aurora, he hunted there.
And that's aside from all his assaults. Even while he was alive, reports of Lindahl's attacks were largely dismissed. One trial was canceled because the victim disappeared.
Here he is trying to hide his face going into court. 2 weeks before Callander was set to testify against Lindahl, she disappeared.
Her body was found a year later. One surviving victim said, quote, "He was a monster. I tried to tell them there was a monster and nobody wanted to listen." Terry Peter Rasmussen, the Chameleon Killer. In 2002, a woman in California went missing. Police discovered her body at the house she shared with a man named Larry Vanner.
Gossip has its place in society sometimes, but I'm just not going to say any more about him soon, or myself right now.
When they arrested Vanner, they found that his fingerprints matched those of Curtis Kimball, who had been arrested in 1985.
Your prints came back. You know your other name, right?
Curtis Kimball.
Curtis Kimball. Ring a bell?
No.
Yeah, that's who you are, man.
The man was convicted as Kimball and died in prison in 2010. Then, DNA evidence revealed that Kimball was also Bob Evans, who kidnapped a girl after her mother disappeared. Finally, in 2017, investigators realized that the same man was connected to an unsolved murder case in New Hampshire from 1978.
What began as one story for me turned into like 4 that spanned the country, spanned 30 or 40 years, and all connected in a way that couldn't be believed at first.
His real name was Terry Rasmussen. He killed at least 6 people, but because of Rasmussen's various identities in different places, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women in the Boston, Massachusetts area were murdered.
These women were strangled. There were sort of decorative bows tied around their necks. It really began to drift like a fog over the city that we had a killer loose in Boston.
Most of them were strangled to death. Albert DeSalvo, who was arrested for assault and burglary, seemed almost insignificant by comparison, until he suddenly confessed to the murders while in custody. Most outsiders assumed DeSalvo was lying. Those who interviewed him weren't so sure, as he seemed to know a lot about the murders.
If the public could have heard this tape of Albert DeSalvo in a semi-hypnotic state, supposedly, he was given the details, and they were pretty convincing and pretty frightening.
However, there was no physical evidence against him, so he was only tried on the original charges. DeSalvo died in prison in 1973, with the Boston Strangler case still unsolved. But finally, in 2013, investigators were able to match DeSalvo's DNA to samples preserved since 1964, and confirmed that he was indeed telling the truth.
From that, a DNA match was made for the first time, confirming Albert DeSalvo as Sullivan's killer with 99.9% certainty. News that Mary Sullivan's family had waited decades to hear.
Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo was one of the worst serial killers in Russian history. He murdered at least 52 people.
When they found some of the victims, you could still see the reflection of horror in their eyes. It was very hard to look at.
And worst of all, there were several times when he was almost caught. As a teacher in the 1970s and early 80s, Chikatilo abused many of his students, but it attracted little attention.
Despite clear evidence that a serial killer was on the loose, Soviet police and the Communist Party-controlled media refused to release any information. In the absence of real facts, rumors spread throughout the region.
His first murder in 1978 was blamed on someone else. When police realized there was an active serial killer, they promptly went after all the wrong people, like men who were gay, mentally ill, or had intellectual disabilities. Chikatilo was arrested in 1984, but dismissed as a suspect because they thought he had the wrong blood type.
Police laboratories mishandled a blood test that could have tied Chikatilo to the crimes.
Well, the Russian police were, first of all, technologically in the Stone Age, and in terms of organization were on that level as well.
It wasn't until 1990, too late for many of his victims, that he was finally caught and convicted. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. For someone whose IQ apparently tested in the low 80s, Gary Ridgway was amazingly clever.
I never had a thought that we weren't going to catch him. I just wondered how, when, and where. And I knew I wanted to be a part of it.
He murdered 48 women in Washington state, yet evaded capture for almost 20 years. He hid his victims deep in the woods or the river. He even left other people's trash near the bodies to confuse investigators. Ridgway was actually a suspect in 1982, soon after the murders began, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him until 2001.
The net was finally closing in on the man next door, 52-year-old Gary Ridgway.
Ridgway was something of an enigma. He claimed to hate sex workers, but frequently hired them, even while married. He was devoutly religious one moment, murderous the next. Perhaps he's best summed up in his own words, quote, "Choking is what I did, and I was pretty good at it."
In November 2003, Gary Ridgway was convicted of 48 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms in prison.
Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. Like Chikatilo, Lonnie Franklin seemed to avoid suspicion with remarkable ease.
And you were accused of not caring because they were black women.
Yes, there were a few activists that were there accusing us of doing nothing. That was not true.
Shepard says the LAPD didn't have the manpower nor the technology at the time to solve the multiple murders.
After being kicked out of the Army for sexual assault, Franklin settled in Los Angeles, California. He was convicted of assault and theft in LA as well, but never linked to the murders sweeping poor communities in the 1980s and 90s. Evidence suggests that the police may have been slower to investigate because the victims were poor people of color.
Look how many years it was. I mean, it was a 30-year gap almost before they eventually caught somebody. 30 years to catch a black person that killed another black person. 30 years. Why is that? Because they weren't really looking.
Despite witnesses providing a description of him and Franklin being arrested on felony charges in 2003, he remained unsuspected. It was only when investigators traced DNA from the crimes to Franklin's son that they went after Franklin himself. In 2016, he was convicted of 10 murders, but he is suspected of many more.
And I'm fairly certain that Lonnie Franklin was going to take to the grave all of the information regarding the unprosecuted, unknown victims that we were never able to put together.
Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Unlike most killers on this list, Rader wanted recognition. To people in his daily life, he was a model citizen, church official, Boy Scout leader, loving husband and father.
The man behind these gruesome killings was living amongst his victims in the very town he was terrorizing.
But the Kansas police knew him as a vicious killer because he told them. From 1974 to 1991, as he was murdering people, Rader sent chilling letters. Quote, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" one said.
The thought process was, we won't give him credit for it, with the idea that this will prompt a communications from him. And it did.
Then in 2005, he made a mistake. IT experts were able to recover a deleted file that included Rader's name and the name of his church.
The software is registered to a specific user. In a matter of seconds, Detective Stone pulls up that name, as well as information on the author of the note itself.
If it hadn't been for that last boast, he might never have been caught. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. He was known as the Visalia Ransacker and the original Night Stalker, among other things, before police realized it was the work of one man. His murders inspired terror across California in the 1970s and 80s.
He attacked across the state from Sacramento down to Orange County, across 15 different jurisdictions.
He was the boogeyman. He was the man in the bushes that we didn't know who he was, and we didn't know when he was going to strike again.
It would take over 40 years to catch him, and some outside help. DeAngelo knew police procedure and left no traces for investigators to follow. The advent of DNA testing helped to connect him with various crime scenes, but his DNA didn't match any in the police database.
California maintains the third largest DNA database in the world, but investigators got no hits for the Golden State Killer. It seemed he had managed to even elude technology.
Then in 2017, retired investigator Paul Holes had an idea. He put the killer's DNA sample on a genealogy website and found DeAngelo's great-great-great-grandparents. Officials were finally able to track down DeAngelo and put him away for life.
You thought you were so smart, but you were wrong. You're not getting away with this.